I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today, and I'm very excited about today's guest. We have Professor Jesse Richardson coming from out east. Professor Richardson, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and where you're teaching right now?
Okay, well, thank you, Carrie. I'm glad to be here today. I'm a professor at West Virginia University College of Law. I was born out here in Virginia, taught at Virginia Tech for a while. I'm an Ag Econ major and used to be president of the American Agricultural Law Association. So I've represented a lot of ag clients, and I'm excited to do a podcast with you.
So a few years ago, we did a few webinars with the American Bar Association. One was on local food. And I remember you had a very strong interest on insurance during that program. So I just wanted to have a little bit more of a thorough conversation on insurance as it applies to agriculture operations here. So if you could, just as a broad stroke here, what is insurance on a general basis?
Well, insurance is basically you transfer the risk of the legal risk of your operation to somebody else, in this case, the insurance company. And of course, they don't want your risk unless you pay them. So you pay them a premium. And if something happens, if you get sued, or if you buy hazard insurance, if your barn burns down or the like, if you're covered, and that's an important caveat, then the insurance company will step in and pay for that loss so that you don't have to.
And there are a lot of different kinds of insurance. So when a farmer comes to you and says, I've got insurance, you know, it's the next question is, well, what kind? And could you give us just a general overview of some common types of insurance?
Yeah, and just, being brief, I know we don't have a lot of time today, but I mentioned hazard insurance. That's for fire, earthquakes, wind, floods. So you can buy hazard insurance on your farm buildings, on your house, on your equipment, so that if some hazard happens and you lose your equipment or lose your buildings, the insurance company will pay for that. I think mainly we're going to focus today on liability insurance. That is if you become legally liable for somebody to someone else for some of the actions that you did, or maybe for something that you didn't do. And that's not going to cover contracts. Contracts are something that is difficult to get insurance for, but it covers what lawyers call torts, which is a non-contractual obligation to somebody. The easiest way to explain it is like a car accident, or you're negligent, you're careless, and somebody gets injured. Then if you have an insurance policy, that liability insurance policy will cover you. Lawyers have professional liability insurance policies to cover them if we give bad advice to somebody or something of that nature. So I think you can also get workers' compensation insurance if you're an employer, and that would cover you if one of your workers gets injured. You can get health insurance. I'm trying to think. Can you think of any other policies that I'm missing?
Well, I get some questions sometimes about food product liability insurance.
Ah, yes.
A new growing trend has been with cyber insurance. And I'm also sometimes a little confused about the difference between environmental insurance and hazard insurance. I don't know if you have any thoughts there along those lines.
Now, I'm not familiar with fiber insurance. What does that
Oh,
cover?
in environmental insurance.
Okay. So
So
environmental liability, it's part of your liability policy, but a lot of farmers are going to have a general farm liability policy. And you have to be really careful to read that policy, which I know sounds painful. But look at that policy, consult with with a lawyer about it, talk to your insurance agent about it. It has a very limited coverage. So make sure you know what's covered and what's not. Products liability insurance is, or products liability is the liability that you have if you sell a defective product. And for farmers, that's going to be food. And you sell produce, you sell meat, whatever you sell, and it makes somebody sick, that's products liability. And that's pretty much strict liability, so it doesn't matter how careful you were. Your general farm liability policy is probably going to have a limited amount of products liability coverage. So if you're selling a lot of food, you need to talk to your insurance agent and see about adding a rider or getting an additional policy to add to your product's liability coverage. And under that general farm liability policy, once you process the food, you're not covered. And that could be as simple as you sell produce at a farmer's market, you take your cantaloupes there, they're so beautiful that you cut them in half so that the people can see what they look like inside. You've just processed it and it's not covered. Environmental liability is similar. You're going to have to get a rider to your policy or an additional policy, and that would be something like your manure tank breaks, fails, and manure flows into a nearby stream. It kills some fish and creates some pollution. You're probably not covered for that under a general liability policy. So if that's an issue, you should talk to your insurance agent and see how much it would cost to add that coverage for your policy.
in terms of general comprehensive liability policies, what is typically covered and what is typically not covered?
What is typically covered is if someone is damaged due to your carelessness or negligence, it will cover their personal injuries, their property damage, lost wages, things of that nature. It will not cover punitive damages if what you do is really outrageous. And it won't cover you if you intentionally go out and hurt somebody. It would have to be if you do something negligent. And I think really important, and another type of policy that just came to mind is agritourism. Um, you have to be really careful about what activities are covered. Under the general policy, it's basically production activities. So if you're out there planting corn, harvesting corn, feeding the cattle, a little bit of sales, but not a whole lot. So once you go beyond production, you want to check with your agent. I'm going to have a corn maze. I'm going to sell things at the farmer's market. I'm going to do custom work for a neighbor or any of that type of thing that you're going to do that is beyond normal. Make sure you're covered for that. Or even like if you have a website and your website starts spreading a virus, that's not covered under the general policy.
So, do you think that there are really a lot of differences from insurance company to another insurance company, or if somebody just has a general comprehensive liability policy, is it pretty much the same whether or not they get it from X or Y company?
I think in general, the general policy is pretty much the same from company to company, but I think it's important compare the prices, but also go ahead and put the policies side by side, and there will be slight differences, and make sure that those differences don't negatively impact you.
How would you compare the general comprehensive liability policy to something like homeowners insurance? Is there overlap there? Would homeowners insurance cover some of the activities on the farm?
There may be a little overlap, but it is not much. So I would say that your auto insurance policy, your homeowner's policy, your general policy are complementary to each other. And I think you need all of them. And check and see what activities you're doing and what is covered. But I think there may be some general farm comprehensive policies that cover homeowners issues, but again, that's going to differ a little bit from company to company. And I can't emphasize enough talking to your agent and seeing what's covered and what's not. And when they answer your questions, make sure you get it in writing so that
So,
you can confirm that later.
do you have any advice for our listeners on how to find a good insurance agent that really understands production agriculture?
That's a good question, and I get that question a lot. I think the most important thing is talk to your neighbors and see they may have had a good experience or a bad experience and learn from that. Talk to your extension agent. Most extension agents can't endorse anybody, but they can give you a list of people who they think is good. So I think word of mouth is probably the best.
So sometimes when I'm negotiating farm leases, insurance comes up as a negotiated
Mhm.
term. Who is typically paying for the insurance? Is it the landlord or the tenant in that context? And then also, how do you know what amount of insurance is appropriate for that particular situation?
Both great questions, and this may differ in different parts of the country. So I'll be interested to see what you think, Carrie. But in my part of the world, smart landlords will put in the lease that the tenant must obtain the liability policy, and the landlord is named as an additional insured. And naming that additional insured should cost you very little or nothing on the policy.
What does that mean exactly when they say add somebody as an additional insured? Uh, what do they mean?
That means that that person is also covered under the policy. What would generally happen as a lawyer, you know how we are, Carrie. If I'm going to sue somebody, I'm probably going to sue the landlord and the tenant,
Mhm.
and they're both going to be dragged to court. And if both are named as insured on the policy, the company is going to cover both of them. And so it's really important. So those additional insureds, when you sell something at a farmer's market, the farmer's market should be asking you for an insurance policy that covers them. If you have vendors on your property for a festival or for a corn maze, you should be asking them for policies that cover you as well, because you might be liable for something that they do. As far as how much, that's a really hard question. And I think it depends on part what kind of assets do you have. If I owned a $5 million ranch or farm, I might be inclined to have a $5 million policy to cover myself. I think as a minimum, I would say that $2 million these days is a good minimum. I used to say $1 million, but I think 2 million is a good minimum. And I'll make your insurance agent work. I would ask my agent, how much is 2 million? How much is 3 million? How much is 4 million? How much is 5 million? And you're going to find that the difference probably isn't that great. And then it becomes what makes you comfortable and what can you afford? Which policy is going to make you sleep really well at night?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I guess for me, as a general rule, I look at the value of the land and the assets and try to have an
Yeah.
insurance policy that's at least that. But all right, my next question is about umbrella policies. I don't know about you, but I feel like there's a lot of confusion on what exactly an umbrella policy is. And if somebody's looking for, let's say, $5 million of coverage, is it cheaper for them just to have a $5 million umbrella with, let's say a $1 to $2 million general comprehensive liability policy?
Yeah, good question. And it may well be cheaper to have $1 or $2 million as your underlying insurance and then put an umbrella on top of that that makes it 5 million. So most people in ag are going to have their automobile insurance, their homeowners, their general liability. They might have products liability, a whole bunch of other policies. Then what you can do, and I have an umbrella policy myself. They call it an umbrella because it kind of goes on top of all your other policies and adds to the coverage. So let's say I'm in an automobile accident and I have $1 million policy and I exceed that $1 million. If I have a $5 million umbrella policy, it then kicks in to cover the difference up to a total of 5 million. And umbrella policies are generally very inexpensive. I think I pay like $150 a year for my umbrella policy. So definitely something to talk to your agent about to see how can you use that umbrella policy in your overall insurance strategy.
So I don't know about you, Professor Richardson, but I've always felt that the word umbrella is confusing for people because I think that it makes people think that it fills in all the holes. When in actuality, I view it more as a top hat. So whatever you currently have, it raises the limits. So I don't know your thoughts on that.
I like that analogy. I think a top hat would probably be a better analogy because if you don't have those underlying coverages, the umbrella policy doesn't help you. So that's a great analogy.
Right, exactly. Well, Professor Richardson, we've got listeners from all over the country, and I was wondering your thoughts for farmers and ranchers who are looking for, perhaps an insurance review from an agriculture attorney in their community. Where do you think that they should reach out or find the right person to consult with?
Again, I would talk to my neighbors, my extension agent. I would talk to people in the community and see if they've had good or bad experiences with lawyers in the area and go with that. And also, I think it's a good idea just to have an attorney that represents you, even if you just go in and chat with the attorney once a year just to see how the weather is. So if you don't have an attorney, I would recommend that you talk to your neighbors, get 3 or 4 or 5 names, and go talk to all of them. Most attorneys will give you a free initial consultation or a reduced rate consultation. Find out who you're comfortable with, and then let that attorney know, I want you to represent me. And so in that case, when that emergency comes up, you don't have to play catch up and try to find somebody and then explain to them what you do. You just pick up the phone and say, I've got a problem. And they can get on it pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I mean, last week I was on vacation, and of course, there was an emergency that popped up
Mhm.
with somebody that I have, I've known for a very long time, but he's not a client, and he needs to meet with me tomorrow. And
Mm.
I looked at my parents. I said, if only this person had been a client for this whole time, I probably could have prevented this
Yeah,
problem from happening, and I would know the intimate details of what's going on when the emergency hit. So,
yeah,
at any rate, I love the advice. Find an attorney that you know, like, and trust, that you can work with on this issue or a myriad of other issues as well. So,
yeah.
all right, Professor Richardson, how can people find you? Are you on the interwebs or social
Uh-huh.
media?
I'm on Twitter. I think my handle is Jesse J 8785. And I don't have a blog. I need to be like you and do that kind of thing. But go to law.wbu.edu and you can find my email address and my phone number. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Well, thanks so much for your time and your expertise. I appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Today's question for Ask Carrie comes to us from a cattle producer in Tennessee. He asks, what are some considerations for custom feeding arrangement agreements? So put simply, a custom feeding contract is between a livestock owner and a livestock feeder with market animals, oftentimes with cattle. The following information should be included in a contract, including the identification of the livestock. When I'm drafting these type of contracts, I like to include the type of animal, right? Are we talking about cattle? What are we referencing? Weight, sex, heifers, steers, what are they? What is the breed? Are they Simmental, Hereford, Angus? And then the color of the livestock. So I actually include this as an addendum to the actual contract or an exhibit. So I have the list. You can include the tag number or any other type of identification that you would like to include there. And then the second big issue for custom feeding arrangement contracts would be any specifications for feeding and nutrition, such as are there going to be specific parameters for the feeding regime, including the type of feed, the feeding schedule, access to water, who's responsible for the expenses for the purchase of the feed. A third big issue would be the division of profits or loss. The contract itself should indicate how profit and losses should be divided between the owner and the feeder. Some more considerations include the marketing of livestock. Should the contract detail the approximate timeline for marketing and the desired stage of finish for the market animals? Delivery. It's important to include the approximate date of the delivery, if you have one, the deadline for delivery, and the responsibility for shipping and transportation costs. And something that I always think about along those lines is a risk of loss. I mean, who's going to be bearing the risk if any animals die during the transportation process? Another issue is shrink. The first time I heard this word, I think I was a little girl, and I just started laughing at my dad when he used the word shrink when he talked about cattle. But this term is especially important if rate of gain is used to determine any type of payment. What type of management practices that you want to include in the custom arrangement. This clause can address compliance with livestock animal welfare laws, for example. Here are a few more considerations, and then we'll briefly wrap up, such as the repossession of livestock. Custom feeding arrangement agreements can include a clause that allows for the repossession of animals if they're not being cared for properly, or as well as being able to retrieve low-performing animals from the feeder. Manure handling practices. I've seen this in custom feeding arrangements. So the contract should and can state who will be responsible for the handling and the storage of manure. It's generally the feeder. The feeder will assume the responsibility for any liability related to manure handling, including the compliance with environmental laws at the federal, state, and local level. Veterinary care. This is oftentimes addressed. Which party is responsible for the veterinary care of the animals, including the payment and the notification of the other party. And finally, I think I already mentioned this to you, is the risk of loss. If you have a question that you would like for me to ask, please email me at Carrie@rinkerlaw.com with the subject Ask Carrie, and I'll be sure to address your question on an upcoming episode of Ag Law Today. Again, that email is Carrie, Cari, @rinkerlaw.com, spelled RINCKERLAW.com. You could also find me on a whole slew of social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube. While you're there, go ahead and please subscribe to not only my channel, but also the channel for Ag Law Today, so you don't miss a beat. And you can also subscribe on iTunes as well. So looking forward to the conversation. See you there.